Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest Supply Chain Finance Community webinar. We're here to discuss the topic of digitization in supply chains. We're going to be with you for around 45 minutes, and I can see that we already have several hundred people from across the world logged into today's webinar, and that's a good thing because we have some excellent speakers, and I'm looking forward to a really good exchange of information. I'll be introducing those speakers in a moment, but first, a couple of housekeeping points for all of you. For those who haven't been to one of these before, I'm Mike Hewitt from Adagio Media. I'll be moderating today, so I'll be fielding your questions and passing them on to our distinguished panelists. You can also look at the recording of the webinar after the event, so no need to take detailed notes. The next thing I'd like you to note is that we are taking questions through the tab you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. So you can type your questions into that tab. Towards the end of the webinar, I will ask those questions of you, of our panelists rather, and you may get some written responses afterwards if we aren't able to reach your question in the live webinar. So I said I'd introduce our panelists. In a moment, you'll be hearing from Victor Elliott of the University of Gothenburg and a board member of the Supply Chain Finance Community, and he'll be opening up our debate by giving us an overview of the state of digitization, and perhaps also, because Victor is from Sweden, looking at the Swedish experience of COVID-19 and how they're coming out of it there. Nicolas Marsac is from Trafigura, global superpower, if you like, in commodities, deep experience of trading, and he's going to be giving us, if you like, the corporate point of view of digitizing supply chains, some of the things that you might want to bear in mind in your own journey. And then Sriram Muthukrishnan from DBS Bank will be talking to us about DBS's experience, very wide, particularly across the Asia-Pacific region, of working with its own clients to help them along that digitization journey. So if we're all ready, let's just look at some background first. And I wanted you to look at this slide particularly. It's way back in 2016, before anyone had even heard of coronavirus. And it's from McKinsey. And McKinsey back then was talking about supply chain 4.0, which sort of goes with industry 4.0. This was quite a strong a meme, if you like, at the time. The application of the Internet of Things, we're going to get advanced robotics, we're going to be using artificial intelligence, there's going to be sensors everywhere. The whole supply chain is going to be digitized in a way you wouldn't believe. So it should, in theory, have looked like this. That was 4 years ago, in plenty of time, you might think, for many corporations to move in that direction. The truth is, this has not happened everywhere. In many places, I'm sorry to say, trade and supply chains still look more like this than our robotic friend we saw a moment ago. So why were people not jumping into this digitization transformation of their companies? And here's a piece I came across from ARC Advisory back in 2017, so just a year after that McKinsey article. And these are some of the reasons that companies were quoting for why they just weren't doing digitization. The top one was cybersecurity, data security, privacy, confidentiality. Now, from a later perspective, you might think it's the idea that somehow a piece of paper is inherently more secure than a digital transmission is perhaps not entirely accurate, but nevertheless, genuine concern, and people are remain worried about exactly this. And I think Nicolas from Trafigura, when we have a conversation with him later, does have some experience in this area and maybe share some of his insights into that. Some people couldn't see the business case for digital transformation. Could they see the return on investment? Perhaps not. And linked to that, of course, just a lack of budget. Maybe management aren't buying into this idea. And it was seen, oddly enough, as perhaps a bit of a risk. So for all these reasons, companies perhaps have not been as fast to digitize as they might have been, as we might have hoped when we read those McKinsey articles. And of course, every consultancy was saying something similar. But now we have the pandemic. And bizarrely, while the pandemic is, of course, a global catastrophe, it's done no good at all for economies around the world, and it's caused human suffering on a really terrible scale. But could it actually accelerate digitization? Could the pandemic be the catalyst for the kind of genuine change in supply chains and in trade finance that we've all been waiting for? Well, let's ask the audience. I can see many people ready to talk to us. So you can see on the screen now a poll, and I'm just about to push that out to you, the audience. So on your screens at home or in your office, you should now see a poll popping up, and you can answer that by the miracle of the internet in real time. So what I'm going to do is leave that with you and allow you to come back to that poll in a few minutes when we've heard from some of our speakers, and just see what our audience thinks about this. But I can already see that we asked you during the coronavirus crisis, have your plans to digitize these processes stayed the same? Have they been accelerated, or have they slowed down? Or perhaps you didn't plan to digitize anyway, and so you're just not going to do it whatever happens. And already I can see that 88, 89, 90% of our audience are saying, no, actually, they have accelerated their plans to digitize trade and supply chain finance during this period. So it'll be interesting to see where we end up on that poll. Keep voting if you like. Vote early, vote often, as they used to say in American elections. But in this case, just let us know your views. It's going to be an interesting snapshot of how our audience feels about this issue. So while you're doing that, I'm going to invite Victor Elliott onto the stage. So Victor, as we said, from the University of Gothenburg and the supply chain finance community. So Victor, I'm sincerely hoping you're going to give us a bit of an overview on the pandemic, on digitization, and perhaps, I suspect, a little bit of a view from your home country. Would that be right?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you for this nice introduction, which I think puts the finger on some of the key topics that we are attacking at the moment. So in setting the scene, I just wanted to sort of repeat what we already know, the fact that this is a global crisis, this is a global pandemic, and this is something that hits us all, some worse than others. And as Mike noted, Sweden has taken a somewhat different route than many other countries. We have not moved as far in terms of lockdowns. We have kept our schools open. I'm still allowed to go to work, have been throughout the entire crisis, although we are doing all of our teaching online. And so far, it is not really clear whether the Swedish way has been better or worse. Actually, just in the last couple of weeks, we have had per capita number of deaths that is rather high in a comparative environment. But at the same time, it's very difficult to judge whether the number of deaths at this point is sort of in comparison to the implications of the economic consequences of this crisis in a more long-term situation, better or worse. But one thing which I think is perhaps underestimated, and which I'm hearing more and more of when we talk about digitalization, relates to the picture that I have put on here. So this is actually a picture of a toilet in our summer house. And the thing is that this toilet has no running water, but at the same time, in this summer house, we have 100 megabit broadband. So in Sweden, the sort of infrastructure to become digitized is quite well developed. And I think that a lot of countries is now really have to fast forward their thinking in terms of how to actually digitalize their infrastructure. Because if I just go to my own sort of situation when doing teaching, we can do most of our lectures online, which is not the case, or live, sorry, online, which is not the case for many of my colleagues from other countries, where the students do not have access to really good broadband and therefore cannot watch the lectures live, but has to watch recordings instead, which makes a very big difference. So when thinking about these things, there are a lot of complexities, but something that is one thing that is joined for all of us is that there is consensus that this will cause a global recession. And the sort of expectations are just getting worse and worse in terms of how bad the GDP growth will actually evolve over 2020. And I think that the picture is particularly bad for Europe, actually, which is a bit worrisome from where we are sitting, especially since a lot of these sort of countries are also trading a lot with each other. So if all of these markets are really hit that badly, then this is really bad for Europe. And I think that one of the key things when it comes to Europe is to try to design mechanisms to actually help our small and medium-sized enterprises, so that we don't get a SME catastrophe on the back end of all of this. And that links very much to the supply chain perspective. So before moving into the actual sort of topic, I just wanted to say a few words about the liquidity challenge. So a lot of firms are struggling with liquidity at the moment. We saw early on in the crisis that we had a lot of problems with corporate bonds, especially the lower rated corporate bonds where spreads increased dramatically. This has come down a bit after the sort of large government programs started. But we are still seeing large spreads in these markets, making it a lot more expensive for firms to refinance themselves through the markets. When it comes to banks, we do not yet see any major liquidity problems in the banking sector, although this is something that might evolve as we move along. And I think it's fair to say that it seems like the lessons from the global financial crisis has actually helped us to at least survive and move successfully through the first stage of this crisis. And all over the globe, we have seen how liquidity rules for banks have been relaxed, so that they're actually allowed to utilize their liquidity buffers in case that should be needed. We are also seeing a lot of other sources of emergency liquidity. I want to repeat what Mikhail said in our last seminar, that we are seeing a lot of growth in terms of government debt, and this is likely to become an issue over the years to come. We're also seeing an increasing number of social bonds tailored specifically to sectors that deals with Corona. And we are seeing a lot of sort of additional utilizations of supply chain finance programs in order to try to help suppliers to actually navigate through this crisis. So when we talk about the supply chain and the sort of disruptions, then I think that in the initial stages of the crisis, there was a lot of surprising disruptions due to the Wuhan shutdown. But gradually this has moved into become a demand side problem instead, where we are not seeing as much demand from the consumer side and from the B2B side, which means that stock levels are increasing if you have not been able to cancel orders in time and so on. And we see huge stock fill outs in a lot of places. And we are also starting to see suppliers who's trying to move beyond the B2B model to actually go directly to the consumers with their products instead, when they cannot sell their products via their business customers. On the digital supply chain, we have seen a massive increase, of course, in the activity, which means that we are also experiencing sensitivities. I mean, there is a lot of issues related to cybersecurity. Are we really as safe when working from home in terms of the security measures we have? And I want to repeat one of the sort of most obvious recommendations here, and that is actually to put the cord in to your computer and not sit on Wi-Fi, which many of us do, because the security is so much better when you actually have the cord in than when it's not in. We are also seeing longer lead times for infrastructure components, such as servers and storages, networking gear, and so on. There's a big sort of demand for these things, and again, cybersecurity is at the top of the agenda for many companies in the digital supply chain. So what are these type of technologies that we are seeing and that could potentially be accelerated through this digitalization? Well, blockchain technology, of course. Well, adoption in this area is still rather low. The latest surveys reveal that it's less than 10% of companies that have actually even experimented with blockchain technology. We do see some successful consortia, and that's a promise, but we are still very early on. The potential, of course, is great, and we are continuously seeing increased investment in this area. But there are still legal obstacles, of course, and here I've heard discussions about trying to develop a playbook so that in these type of crisis scenarios, there are specific trade rules that could actually be relaxed in order to allow more digital solutions, maybe move from paper-based trade documents and so on. There's also ecosystem obstacles when it comes to blockchain, in the sense that various players have various levels of readiness to actually start adapting these. And therefore, we are seeing these consortia as a natural response where we try to help each other in the entire ecosystem. When it comes to artificial intelligence, I think it's important first to distinct between automation, which has been an ongoing process for at least 25 years, where we're trying to automate more and more, and actual intelligence, in the sense that we see machine learning mechanisms, we see different types of ways in trying to monitor and identify critical links in the supply chain and so on. But I think here there's a lot of immaturity among companies in terms of moving beyond the first tier of suppliers to actually have a monitoring of the longer term supply chain, so that we know what's going on down in tier 2 and tier 3 and who the real critical suppliers actually are. And I think that the corona situation is going to change a lot how firms think about their extended supply chains and how they want to utilize different types of AI mechanisms in order to monitor and identify which suppliers are really critical and which would be sensitive during a crisis scenario. It is also tremendously important here to remember the legal obstacles when it comes to the black box of AI, so that we actually know what the machine is recommending us to do when we do trade. And why it does it, because otherwise the regulator is going to be quick to step in. And of course, the ethical component. Internet of Things, which Mike mentioned, yes, their potential is great, but again, the cybersecurity issues are also great here. So there is definitely need to be careful in this area. But jointly, I think that the COVID-19 situation has showed us that digital can actually work. A lot of firms have been able to switch to digital and done it quite successfully, of course, with a lot of problems in the process, but it has actually worked. And I think this in itself will accelerate the digitalization of the world and also the digitalization of our supply chains. So we should never underestimate a good crisis, like they say, huh? And I think that COVID-19 has also changed the way that companies think about their supply chain, in the sense that we are discussing this just-in-time concept and whether this is actually the most sort of relevant way of organizing our supply chains, or whether we have to have larger buffers and so on. And the question, of course, is, will we be able to keep this up and the speed of digitalization and make it in a sensible and ethically relevant way? And that's the question that I will likely fast forward to my friends and the next two speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Particularly interesting presentation, because the comparison between the speed of broadband, particularly in Sweden and perhaps in some other countries, and the emphasis you put on actually the sort of hardware, technical, are we actually in a position to support increasing digitization? Will our networks stand it? Can I ask you quickly, and we'll come back to more detailed questions at the end of the the webinar session. What's your own view about our central question? Do you feel the pandemic actually is going to accelerate the pace of digitization, or are people going to back off a little bit and say, do you know what, we've got so many other problems at the moment, the last thing I'm going to do is start an expensive and possibly risky digitization project?
I think it's definitely going to accelerate it. I think, again, it has showed that digital can work, and it has also forced us to do certain things in a digital way. But it has also revealed different cost structures, different problems associated with doing things digital, and that will have to be addressed. And I think it's a good thing that it's being addressed at the moment, because it will teach us how to address it more efficiently in the future, and build standard structures, legal infrastructures, and so on that can actually support a true digitalization of the supply chains.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I can say, you can see this result too if you look at your polls tab. The same question asked of our audience. It turns out that 76% of our audience have accelerated their digitization programs during the coronavirus. 18% have stayed the same, and then very small numbers, 2 and 4%, have either slowed down or didn't plan to digitize. So a fairly overwhelming response that yes, the companies certainly who are joining this webinar are accelerating their digitization programs. So thank you very much for that, Victor. I mentioned earlier that Trafigura, of course, giant in commodities. Nicholas Marsac, CFO for the Asia Pacific region. Nicholas, Victor has given us a really good overview of trade and supply chain finance digitization and some of the things people are thinking about now. So your own company is very much dependent on global trade and supply chains. So what have you done to digitize systems and processes? What's your position at the moment?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mike, for this. Well, look, just for the sake of clarity, as I have to assume that not everybody knows about what commodities trading is about. So as far as Trafigura is concerned, we are a physical trading company, meaning that we're a company that basically source, blends, transport basic goods, so oil refined products, base metals around the globe, from the point where they are produced to the point where they are consumed. So that's quite as simple as that. This is our business. Therefore, our
Nicholas, are you still with us? I think we may have lost Nicholas. He seems to have frozen there. So we'll either get him back in just a second, in which case we'll return, or I'm going to move on.
I'm back.
Ah, you're back. Hooray.
I'm back.
So Nicholas was just explaining Trafigura's status dealing in physical commodities, mixing, blending, and supplying to all over the world. He made a brief reappearance, but we're going to give him a couple of seconds to see whether we can get him back. If for any reason he doesn't, we're going to move forward and hear the DBS perspective in just a moment, and then we can return to Nicholas to get Trafigura's view. Nicholas, hello. It's marvelous to see you back. You were just about to be replaced, but now you're here. You were just telling us about Trafigura's unique status, physical commodities, blending, distributing, etc.
So yeah, exactly. So I suppose our expertise is about managing logistics, operations, meeting deadlines in terms of deliveries. This is really the heart of a physical commodities trading company. The reality of this business is that it's a high volume business, but it's also a low margin business, and low margin business simply because you have a reasonably high amount of transparency in terms of prices. If you talk about oil prices or copper prices, everyone in the world can freely access the information of where the prices are, and are therefore able to challenge the cost of of buying this copper, delivering it to its final destination. So the reality is that at heart, because we are a low margin business, the access to information and the capacity to have access to information in real time is at the heart of our capacity to generate profits. And I would say there's nothing very new about this. So Trafigura was created in 1993. Two very simple examples about this is that as early as the 1990s, we realized that there wasn't an off-the-shelf information system that would allow us to be able to share this global across all our offices in real time. And we developed a fully in-house information system, as early as the 1990s. So the digital tools, if you want, are very embedded in, first of all, in us spreading access to information across our offices in real time. Okay, and also, I'm not going to get into details about this, but also in how we manage our risk, how we anticipate our exposures, etc. So it's very, very crucial in this. Now, obviously, this original system that we developed in the 1990s was, I think, at the beginning set up to welcome around 400 users. We now have more than 8,000 users. So a significant revamping has been started, I think, 6 years ago. And we have been spending literally hundreds of $millions in revamping that system to allow more users, also to make it ready for external connections. External connections meaning automatic downloading of data, okay, to feed our own internal information system, and potentially as a second stage, connect it through other digital trade platforms that may be leading that part of the revolution. I think that's the first point. The second point, and again, I'm going back to what I was saying in terms of being a high volume, low margin business. It means that naturally we are extremely eager to incorporate new technologies, new tools that allow us to have a certain edge, a certain advantage in getting access to information. Okay, and I think that's very much at the heart of driving the capacity to generate profits in a pretty transparent world, i.e. being able to have access to the information that some of our peers don't have, so that we can act quicker. It may not apply to the digital trade or the digital finance platform per se, but I can say that as a group, we have been using already for several years AI type of analytics in order to anticipate the consumption potential of a specific country or specific counterparty. We are obviously using a combination of satellite imaging to try and see how projects around the world are progressing, and therefore when they are likely to restart or simply start producing, refining. We're also using a combination of this satellite tracking and imaging with data coming from ports to assess whether this particular vessel has or loading some gasoline. You can combine the sources of information to have a reasonably good understanding of all the flows of commodities that are happening around the world. To be clear, we are not acting as Big Brother. We are not tracking everything, but obviously, as and when we ask ourselves a question, these maybe newer technologies are here to help us assess. They are not perfect, okay, but they are here to help us assess. And as a company, but I also think as an industry, we are very eager again to have access to the amount of information that maybe others cannot have, and therefore act in advance of the rest of the market.
So it's a competitive advantage, you would say.
Yes.
The level of digitization you have gives you a competitive advantage over rivals or other companies that are perhaps less advanced.
Yes. I guess that answers your initial question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're all interested to know is you've experienced the pandemic just as everyone else has, all those effects that Victor was talking about in terms of slowing trade and slowing demand. But during this difficult time, have you accelerated your push for more digitization, more emphasis on technologies like AI, or have you maybe retreated a little bit and waited until things are calmer?
No, I think it's definitely an accelerating factor, and I will give maybe two big reasons. So I think it's very much of a shame, and I think a number of the participants in the commodities market or even general international trade would agree with me. It's a bit of a shame that we continue to be relying on paper-based documents to demonstrate the loading of cargoes, the transshipment of cargoes, the deliveries, and certification of origins and stuff like this. I mean, in a way, as a company, I think we are. Well, again, we're trading oil and oil refined products, base metals, minerals, and we're starting to trade renewables. But and therefore, there is already a heavy reliance on paper-based documentation. I think it's even worse if you look at soft commodities, which Trafigura doesn't trade, which sometimes require the delivery of a lot of peas, for instance, from Canada, to be evidenced by one single paper by bag of peas that you're shipping from Canada. So you can imagine when you want to get paid for this type of things, you have a pile of documents which is at least that high, probably double that size, and that needs to be reviewed by a number of individuals, really, even if they probably are starting to get support from systems as well or machines, but that needs to be reviewed before a payment can be authorized or declined. So I think that's a shame. What is the COVID-19 bringing to that thing is, for me, at least, is two things. One, something that I find completely amazing is that we've been spending the good part of the past 2 months confined before, but I would say that all organization that is receiving express courier services needs, just for that reason, needs to maintain some form of presence in the office. This is crazy. Yeah. This is crazy. Now, obviously, for us, it's very important because a number of these, documents that are transported by the FedEx, the DHLs of this world, are important for us to get paid by our customers. So there's no choice. It's quite fundamental to our working capital cycle in the end of the day. So obviously we have to accommodate it. But in the 21st century, I find this crazy that all your funding cash cycle is reliant on a slightly archaic document, paper-based documentation in order to get paid. So I think that's the first thing, and I think it's not a weakness per se. I think the services of this type of organization is reliable. But to give you a very practical example, last week I was waiting for some documents, again original documents of a lifting of a cargo of diesel in that case, that was coming from Dubai to Singapore. Under normal circumstances, you have daily flights between Dubai and Singapore. So, as a matter of maximum 2 days, you get your documents. Last week, it took 6 days because airlines are not flying, because you have less easiness in terms of transferring the mailing, in Dubai from the sender to the airport, and then when it arrives from the airport down to the destination of the document. So all this thing is creating delays effectively. You may think it's something small, but if I look at Trafigura, we're a company that has around a turnover of around more than 150 billion. If you lose, so I let you imagine what it means as a daily turnover. If you delay our payments by 2, 4, 5 days, it actually makes to the funding needs that for the company for its working capital, and ultimately to its funding costs as well. Now, it's not like a massive change, but it's not a marginal cost, the delay of documents. And I think this is clearly what one thing that COVID-19 is, one of the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic is going to accelerate the switch to more, e-based documentation for us. It creates a stronger incentive for players of our industry to be investing time and efforts in making the typical trade finance documentation become more electronic than paper based.
And I think we can all agree that's going to be needed. And in a moment, I want to move on to hear about DBS.
Mike, the second thing I wanted to say, just to finish on this, and which is also an accelerating factor, and I think this is new because I think the industry has been looking at the digitalization of trade and the use of blockchain type of trade finance platform as a way to increase its efficiency, as I just mentioned for the courier. Also save on administrative costs. I suppose you need less paper handling if you move into electronic. But I think the second accelerating factor of the COVID-19 on these matters is that I think it's starting to act as a potential risk mitigant for documentary fraud. And I think particularly in Singapore, I think it has been in the international press, there has been a number of recent bankruptcies. The origin of these bankruptcies may not be documentary fraud, but certainly there has been a number of cases attached to that are a matter of double pledging cargoes to their financing banks, creating fake contracts, fake loading documents, and all of this is ultimately, I'm not sure the digital aspects of this will completely annihilate the documentary fraud risk, but certainly it will mitigate that risk very significantly. So I would say for both a matter of improved efficiency on working on our working capital cycle and admin cost, and also, and I think this is really something that the COVID-19 is bringing to the table, as a way to reinforce our documentary fraud risk mitigation tools. I can imagine that digitalization of trade is going to be accelerated.
And I think that's really interesting because we saw in that much earlier ARC piece of research that I showed at the beginning of the webinar that actually the risk of sort of cybercrime was one of the reasons that some companies were resisting digitization. In fact, you're saying that that you can see it as actually accelerating progress towards less fraud and mitigating some of those risks, and that's really interesting.
You're right. I think as any risk mitigation tool, it isn't perfect, and I think it does create, you're right, another type of risk. We've been spending for the past few months, and therefore it's not really related to COVID-19, but we're spending a significant amount of time reviewing the technologies, and we continue to do that. And you're right that I think some technologies. I remember having worked on such a topic with DBS, actually. Some of these technologies are not strong enough to guarantee safety of your data, or at least to be protected from cyber criminal actions. And certainly there's a very strong focus that needs to be there. But on the other side, I think some of them are actually very strong. Again, there's no perfect tool in terms of reducing fraud risk in general, but I think digitalizing this trade, creating digital trade platform is better than not doing it, if you want.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. We'll return for more questions later on. But for now, we've heard from Nicholas that in his company particularly, there are strong incentives, competitive advantage, and indeed greater security in digitization. And we also heard some insight into some of the ways people are still using paper in their supply chains, in their trade finance activities. It seems archaic, but it is the way things have been done, and for many companies, they still feel their strength in that. So let's turn to Sriram from DBS. Sriram, I'm hoping you're going to be able to tell us that DBS is assisting perhaps more clients in the crisis to move online and maybe to get rid of some of that paper. But over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Exactly why I'm here. So we used to be called the Development Bank of Singapore, for those who don't know us. So we have our roots about 50 years back in enabling the development and infrastructure development of Singapore. But of late, we are being referred to as the Digital Bank of Singapore. So you know where I'm going with this. So actually, I really wanted, I had thought of going along a certain, path. But the first thing which I wanted, given the enormity of what we are facing in the global trade, I think there are multiple aspects of digitization which are coming to play. Victor covered the fact that the impact of on the global economy. The WTO expects that there will be a 13 to 32% decline in international trade, depending upon the 30 to 32 ranges, because we don't know how long this COVID recovery will last. That compares to a 12.5% impact on international trade during the global financial crisis in 2009. So you can see that the enormity of what we're facing right now. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, what we've learned is that there are certain things that we didn't plan for. So I'll pick up from where Nicholas left off, which is the whole digitization of trade. Now, when the COVID pandemic struck, and then we went into lockdowns and circuit breakers across different economies, what banks and also trading companies, large companies like Trafigura, as well as smaller SMEs, did not cater for is that, first of all, there was going to be a huge disruption to the way they operate. There is the dual impact of a demand reduction, but also at the same time there was a supply chain disruption. So that happened at the same time. So we can not only don't you have demand, but even when you have demand, you can't enable it because you have a supply problem. And on the banking and just interactions between business partners, there was a big change in the way that they would interact with each other. So you could, in the past, have used, and Nicholas said, all this paper going back and forth. You can print out, you can get your director or your manager to sign off, and you can ask the courier boy to come up and take the documents and take it across. And in 2 days, it gets across from Dubai to Singapore. Suddenly, that underwent a complete change, right? We had entire cities and countries in a lockdown situation. Courier services were disrupted. Staff was working from home. So the usual things that we take so much for granted, just press print and you can print out the 50-page document, get it vetted and signed, and it's rushed across. And I think that is what we've been pushing for many years now, is how do we get away from this whole way of doing things and make it more digital. And I think the question that you asked at the very beginning, I am a very big proponent of the fact that I think the COVID-19 situation has forced a lot of us to take stock, of how we digitize our work environment. And here I want to pick up on the item that Nicholas mentioned in terms of fraud. I think that while we do need potentially to further strengthen how we look at information security, especially from hackers and things like that. But I think the kinds of consortia-led approaches and the platform-led approaches that Nicholas talked about, I think it talks to mitigating fraud in the real world. So when you're able to use, let us say, blockchain technology, and you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 different participants on a trade finance transaction, and all the transactions are individually captured on that platform, and you're able to triangulate that information, I think you can actually do a lot to mitigate or to reduce fraud. So I'm very much with Nicholas on that. And it was mentioned that DBS Bank has been working with Trafigura on some of these initiatives, and I think it is a step in the right direction. In terms of just stepping back from fraud, I think digitalization can impact customers and the way they bank and the way they interact across every aspect of that life cycle. So if I look at how DBS operates, we have something called, we look at customers from the time we acquire them and how we enable them to transact and get their job done, and also ongoing basis, how do they engage or manage their engagement levels with the bank, or with also other partners on their ecosystem. So what we've done in the recent few years, it is not necessarily that we could develop everything in response to the COVID situation, but because we've been working in that direction for a few years now, we actually had a number of tools. And in the past, when we went to customers and showed them some of these opportunities to digitize, it was oh yeah, let me see, let me prioritize. But with the COVID situation, actually they're saying, I can't do this fast enough, so show me how. And we can't show you how by coming over to your office. We can only show it to you, over the WebEx or over the phone. So that was the first step, right? And then what we've actually got is, if you want to open an account, we have something called online account opening service, where customers can validate, can come onto the platform, the Dbs platform, can validate, provide the credentials. We are in many countries like Singapore, China, and India, we are able to do a lot of validation of those credentials for KYC purposes digitally, and also hook up with multiple government and other agencies to also triangulate the data. The second thing that we are also able to do is from a supply chain perspective. So let us say you are a large buyer and you want to roll out a supply chain finance program. The COVID situation tells us right now is when the smaller suppliers in the supply chains really need the maximum amount of liquidity support, and it is drying up because liquidity always becomes a scarce commodity during times of crisis. The larger customers are able to still draw down on their revolvers, but the smaller SMEs always bear the brunt. But if they're part of a large, anchor's supply chain finance program, they could potentially benefit and get over this period. But if they can't visit the bank, or if you are going to look at conventional means of onboarding onto these programs, again, it's going to not work, because who's going to visit you or give you forms to sign? So what we've done is basically got something called digital onboarding. So what we do is, on the portal, we can do two things. Either the large buyer can give us a lot of information about the supplier. We pre-populate that, and we allow the supplier to come on board and sign up digitally. On the other hand, if a supplier wants to do this, initiate this whole process on his own, he can do the same. He can come onto the portal, provide his credentials, express his interest, and he can actually sign up for these programs digitally. For existing customers of the bank, again, we have a number of ways through which we allow them to seek new financing, entirely digitally. And recently we had in Singapore, the Singapore government launched something called the Network Trade platform, through which you can do customs declarations, and you can also engage with your banking partners. So we were the first bank to do a few of these transactions, issuance of letters of credit for Audi, or issuance of BGs for some other customers, and this was all done entirely digitally. The customer didn't have to come from their office or home. The other thing, when we talk about paper-based trade, as Nicholas mentioned, I think we really need to get away from it. And one use case for that is, of course, fraud prevention. But simply the other use case is, common sense. Because over the years, we've been spending so much of time cutting down so many trees just to evidence, the transfer of title. It can now be done using digital means. And we have something called DigiDocs. So in our own environment, what customers can do is they can stop sending us paper forms, paper copies of contracts and invoices, and they can actually load these images and data onto a portal using this DigiDocs functionality. And of course, there are a number of third-party platforms. The one that we worked on, ICZ Trade Trust with Trafigura. There's also Contour that we are on. We're working on a few large commodity transactions there. We are also on the Network Trade platform, as I mentioned. So, and there are a number of them. And I think customers corporates need to think about which of these platforms are best suited for their own type of business and type of flows. But I think the time to go digital is now. The 18 or 17% who have stayed the same or slowed down, I really urge you to start thinking about whether that is the best thing for your business. And I would be very keen to know why you would slow down at this point of time. So that is, a few bites on what we are trying to do. And in terms of, looking at sort of advice to corporates, apart from my earlier spiel about the fact that they need to go digital and eliminate manual workflows, think about how you don't need to depend upon your location centricity. Working from an office is going to be the past. You can work from anywhere and you can still get a banking done. You got to think like that. The second thing is that I think supply chain financing has come back in fashion, and as it usually does during periods of crisis. When things are okay, people take it for granted, and they can take their own time to launch these programs. But I think at this point of time, if you look back, a lot of corporates are saying, "Hey, I should have done this earlier." And an example of this is, it is not just about helping your SME suppliers. In the current situation, Your SME supplier has only so much capacity to take your orders. So guess whose orders he's going to take and prioritize and fulfill? The anchor who gives him the financing support. So we got to think a bit more along those lines. And the most important thing is there's a lot of pessimism, when you read the press about what is happening in the global economy. But I would say that the time to prepare for the reopening of the world economy is now, because there will be, a recovery. We can only see in many countries that the curve is flattening and it's coming down. So when eventually it comes off, the world is waiting for a recovery, and that means that we are all going pushing for a V-shaped recovery, so a steep recovery. So the ones who prepare for it now, prepare the supply chains for it now, are the ones who are going to be able to take early advantage when that happens. So my earnest request to corporates on this call is please start thinking about how you're going to prepare for a post-COVID world so that you can take advantage of it. Thanks, Mike.
No, thank you. Tremendous presentation and some really interesting points raised. Your point about suppliers giving preference to those that give them good terms. Those of us that were with us on our last SCF community webinar may remember a very similar point being made by Siemens, which has definitely seen that people who access its supply chain finance program are more likely to be, let's call them, loyal suppliers. So just a reminder, in the questions tab, if you type in your questions, I can see them. But don't worry, your colleagues and other people on the webinar can't, so you're quite safe if you'd like to ask a question. And we do indeed have a couple that have come in. And our first one is from Sam, and Sam asks, Sam Marcera, I don't know whether you're it's a female Sam or a male Sam, sorry, but Sam asks, isn't it possible for large players in supply chains to simply insist on digitization as a condition of doing business? So in other words, isn't it possible to begin to get rid of some of the paper in supply chains by large organizations saying, you know what, we're simply not going to trade if you are still stuck with paper? I suspect I know the answer to that, but we'll ask some of our panel. And Nicolas, I'm going to come to you first. It's a reasonable question. Is it possible to say, do you know what, if you're using a ton of paper, then we're not dealing with you?
Somehow I felt you are coming to me, so that's why I switched on my camera again. Okay, so the reality is, I think whether some of the consultancy shop, including the one that you quoted at the beginning of your presentation, may think, we have to accept it's a journey. Okay, the world is not going to turn digital from one day to the other, and with some counterparties, yes, you're right. I think it's reasonably easy to collaborate, to cooperate in creating, going forward, a fully digital way of dealing with, starting from contracts. I mean, that may sound silly, but the vast majority of the contracts in our industry continues to be paper-based, but this is slowly changing already. I think we started maybe 2 years ago, that would have been 0% of the contracts which would be digital. If you want my own estimates, it will be around maybe 2-3%, but it's not insignificant. So it's starting. Similarly to the digital finance platform, you start by needing to find, I guess, a platform that you both are comfortable with in terms of security, IT security matters, and authentication matters. But I think that's a reasonably quick win. Then I think how digitalization will occur is you'll start by the lowest hanging fruit. So, after the COVID-19 situation, we've started to identify which are the likely lowest hanging fruit in terms of digitalization. I'm talking particularly for trade finance matters. I give you a few that have been identified as reasonably easy potential candidates. Cargoes that we store in storage facilities that are in OECD countries. Typical storage companies in OECD countries have an electronic way of tracking the quantities of material that they have in their tanks or in their warehouses. Okay, then if that data exists in a digital form, then I think it's reasonably easy to imagine that you're going to be able to use this in addition to our own digital data, make them meet and obviously the other members of the chain, the banks, the inspectors, to make it possible reasonably quickly. You're still talking about, I think, a good year to get everybody around the table in agreement on how they will operate. But I think that's potentially a lower hanging fruit. Another one is bunkering. Bunkering is very standard business from an operational perspective. You come with a certain quantity of low sulfur fuel oil or diesel, you deliver it to a ship. There's delivery notice that gets issued, currently paper-based. There is nothing it's all very standard. Okay, that I think is also something that, also the bunkering activities are happening within one specific jurisdiction, not only one on a global basis, but always around hubs of bunkering activities around the world. So that's reasonably possible. Just to give you some potential low-hanging fruits. Now, if you start talking about digitalizing a trade that consists in taking a cargo from, say, Latin America to China, okay, you're talking about putting around the same table, yes, a supplier based in somewhere in Latin America. You're probably custom agents of that particular Latin American country, the ship owner, okay, the custom office of the receiving country, that in my example China, and the customer, and obviously the person in the middle, which is us. That I think is going to take some time to achieve. Okay, so that's important to start by the low-hanging fruit, in my opinion, and then grow from there.
And I guess, thank you very much. I have to sort of stop you there because I can see we're getting close to time, and that the regulatory piece you mentioned is particularly interesting. We haven't had time to touch on that, but yes, of course, country regulators will have to get involved. Floris, we could get to your question. In fact, we have a minute left or so. So a brief answer to this from anyone who would like to have a go at it. Floris asks, is anyone working on autonomous products that can make or receive autonomous payments? Could there be open standards and infrastructures that facilitate cyber-secure autonomous products and payments? I think that might be, if we're struggling to get out of paper-based conventional trades, the idea of autonomous payments, I guess that feeds into maybe blockchain and the idea of smart contracts where payments are automatically released. Victor, I'll come to you as the academic, and I think you knew I probably would. Are you aware of anyone working on this kind of thing where payments are autonomous? Could there be open standards for autonomous automatic payments?
Yes, so we do have, I mean, there's a whole regime considering this idea about smart contracting, right? And of course, smart contracting is still just programs, if then programs. But the legal community is working on making actual real smart contracts that do have a basis from contractual law that would actually facilitate these type of autonomous payment structures. There's a very nice initiative going on in Italy at the moment, where the Italian banking system is working on a blockchain-based solution. It's based on the Corda network from the R3 consortia. And I don't know how much COVID-19 has sort of disrupted their efforts, but they were supposed to go live during this spring and have full application by September, I think, in order to do autonomous payments and remittances via a blockchain-based solution involving initially 18, I think, Italian banks.
Great. And so I'll just have to stop again because of time. Sriram, I just want to bring you in quickly on this one because I know this is something you're interested in. Autonomous payments happening already, possible, or still a dream?
No, I think it is. The smart contract piece is starting to gather steam. There's a lot of work happening in pockets in different parts of the world. I think this whole, blockchain-based, approach towards, especially letter of credit and large commodity flows is heading in that direction. I just want to bring a slightly different tack to it, which is easier and can potentially scale up. Something that DBS believes in is the API. So what we use for some of our large corporates is we employ APIs to say that, if, a certain condition is met in terms of there is an invoice provided, matches the purchase order, and the payment has to be made to the supplier, the API can actually take care of that automatically for the corporate because the conditions of the payment have been met. This is something that we recently deployed for a large agri commodity trader in Singapore. And I think that is another way to go. The benefit of this kind of a solution is that it doesn't need a huge consortium or an entire community to come together. As you've seen, it always takes 5 to 10 years to get that to happen. And while that is happening, I think working with individual large corporates and ecosystems, deploying API is another way to get there faster.
Okay, that's enormously helpful, and I can see already that there are a great many more questions, but we are on the hour. We sort of promised we'd finish about now, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. To cover off all those things that we haven't had time to cover, we could have spoken more about regulation, we could have spoken more about smart contracts, we could have spoken more about cybersecurity. I'd like each of our panelists, if you can, just to give us one piece of advice. If you're a corporate listening to this webinar, what's the one thing you'd say to them that you could do now, your first priority, if you want to move towards digitization, what should you do? So I'm going to ask each of you that in turn in just a moment. Before we do, the inevitable promotion for our own products, of course, we have to do this. But first of all, thank you very much to DBS for sponsoring this series, because without DBS's participation and forward thinking in this area, these wouldn't happen. Our next one is about faster onboarding, how we can get these, particularly supply chain finance programs, launched fast when it really matters in a crisis. So how can we speed that up? That's on June 25th, and you can register by simply going to that URL. Just search Livestorm Adagio Media, which is our company, and you will find that. And I have no doubt you'll be getting a promotion. So one piece of advice, short, sharp, give us your 10-second view. Victor, I can see you're unmuted, so I'm going to come to you first because that's easier. What's the one thing we should do when we leave this webinar?
Continue to exploit a good crisis. Continue to utilize the benefits of going digital in this COVID situation, and try to spend resources on becoming more efficient. That's
excellent. Nicholas, one thing you think people should do, that your 10-second version?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, in my opinion, I think there's a number of people that may think that they want to stress corporates about their need for digitalization. I think it's happening. You just need to be alert, calm, assess what as a tool it brings to your organization, and decide whether it's a good idea or not. There's no rush.
Great.
That's also the reality.
Okay, thank you. And Sriram, I think you're still with us. If you are, your 10-second tip, the one thing we could all do?
Sure, Mike. I think I already covered the 3 takeaways of corporates, but the most important one for me is actually, this is a time when potentially activity is a bit slow. But I think you should prepare for the reopening of the economy in the future. So prepare now. And the second thing, I need to give 2 things. The other one is that people think of digitization as a very onerous, difficult, costly stuff. But actually, there are lots of processes which can be digitized at a low cost and can be done relatively easy. There are a lot of tools out in the market. A lot of your banking partners will actually provide you some of this stuff for free. So don't let those freebies go away. Use them and start your digitizing journey if you haven't.
That's excellent. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Again, thank you to DBS for your support. Thank all of you for being online, and we hope to see you again on June the 25th. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.